Wherever the British Empire went, they found an easier way. The easiest way to rule was to divide. They did that in Ireland, India, the division of the Middle East during the Ottoman period. A lot of the troubles in today's world are the outcome of Churchill and imperial policies carried out by the British in that part of the world. So there's no forgiveness. History is still with us.
Welcome to the Big Picture podcast. My name is Muhammad Hassan, and today we talk about the untold and often brutal legacy of the British Empire. A legacy that was reformed and romanticized in modern times through the image of Winston Churchill. To do that, I sat down with British Pakistani writer, activist, and public intellectual Tariq Ali. Ali has consistently questioned and prodded Britain's history, writing from the voice of a global South forcing their colonial masters to account for their past crimes. His most recent work is a biography of the iconic wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, arguably one of the most written about historical figures in our time. But the book, titled Winston Churchill, His Times, His Crimes, walks a different line. Far from the image of Churchill as a brilliant orator and an unconventional statesman who became the moral voice of the West against Hitler, the portrait Ali paints is one of a self-obsessed, ruthless, and deeply racist colonial leader who lost little sleep over his crushing attempts to maintain Britain's rule. In particular, his actions in Ireland, Kenya, and Bangladesh led to some of the most horrific atrocities of the 20th century. Now, this conversation takes place before October 7 and the war on Gaza. But this quote from Churchill in 1936, speaking about the expected displacement of Palestinians by Zionists, is very telling. Quote, "I do not agree that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly, wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." So who is the real Winston Churchill? And what does his legacy teach us about the history of Britain? Tariq Ali, thank you very much for being with us. Welcome to the Big Picture.
Very nice to be with you.
I want to speak to you about Winston Churchill, who you have biographed in this book, who you are also very clearly an admirer of because you spent so much time digging into his history and his past and all of the colorful things that he has been quoted as saying over time, which is a lot. You know, he was somebody that spoke a lot, that wrote a lot. And what was that experience like in trying to document somebody with such an abundance of material?
Well, you know, I had a different idea to most biographers because Churchill has become such a huge cult figure in this country and to a certain extent in the United States that I knew the story. I had read a number of his books before, but this time what I did was to read the biographies written about him, not all of them, but the worst ones and some of the best ones. And I wanted to contextualize Churchill, not present him as an individual with faults and, merits and all this, but to contextualize him and put him in the context of his time and the times that created the English ruling class that produced Churchill. So I did a lot of historical study and historical work to explain the formation of social classes in this country, their divisions, their rows, their fights. So Churchill for me was much more than the person who emerged during the Second World War to lead this country. For me, he was an imperialist warlord, a ruling class politician who had very little sympathy for the working class in this country. and who fought always on two fronts against his enemies, or people he thought to be his enemies abroad, and against the enemy within, as they used to call it, the miners, the railway workers, etc., at home. So I wanted to write a very different type of biography, and that's why I put his crimes up front.
And one of the interesting things in reading this is that, as you said, a lot of the book is spent talking about the historical context, what was happening in the world, what was happening in the times where Churchill emerged. And at times, as a narrator, it seems that you are much more interested in these things than you are with his, particular take on them.
Yeah, we know everything about him since, we've had hundreds of books written about him. We have had 3 drama series in Britain alone, 4 movies. So what more is there to know about him? So it was pointless to repeat all that stuff, good or bad. So I decided to do the book in a different way and also study the impact of Churchill's policies, or British imperial policies, which he represented, to see their impact in India, in Palestine, and then even during the Second World War itself, what Churchill did in Greece, crushing the Greek resistance, that it played a major part in helping to defeat the fascists and the Third Reich. And this resistance was crushed because Churchill was worried they would win after the war as well. A resistance led largely by the Communist Party of Greece and allied groups of the left. It was a left-wing resistance. So, what amazed me is when I sort of talk about the book, so many people don't know this stuff, and they're quite shocked. And why are they shocked? They're shocked because the Churchill presented to them as that of a god, a little icon you put in your homes and you worship. And this is I wanted to stress also that this is a relatively new development. That during his life, Churchill was not treated in that fashion. In fact, at the height of the Second World War, in 1942, there was serious talk about removing him as Prime Minister and finding someone else because of the defeats the British had suffered in Tariq and in Singapore, etc. So, in this image of Churchill, which we see today as a British godhead, is linked very much to Mrs. Thatcher's victory in the 80s and her decision to wage war on the Falklands, on Argentina, to keep the Falklands British. And they needed a symbol, and what better symbol, she thought, than Churchill. So that's the time they started building him up. And I point out in the book that in the 60s and 70s, Churchill was the butt of satirists. They attacked him. There were plays written about him. There were criticisms made about him and imperial policies in that period. And that people have forgotten. And the young don't know. So what has pleased me a lot is that the response I've had from young people is incredibly positive. I've had lots of emails from, people between the ages of 18 and 30 saying we had no idea. We had no idea. So that is the reason I think why the book is doing, despite, not too many reviews, especially from the liberal press, The Guardian didn't review the book, the London Review of Books didn't review the book, etc. But the right attacked it, and that got it noticed. So, I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased that I did this book, because its aim is to educate, really, is to say, here is another view. We live in times where people don't like listening, whatever subject, whatever the debate, on the other side. They don't like debating. It's a sort of culture in which often people say, oh, I don't want to read the book because it refers to X and Y who we love in a bad way. And this has created a very narrow Philistine culture today. And I wanted to sort of break through that as well for those who worship Churchill, and get people to read it so they know. I mean, daubing paint is fine on a statue. I have no objection to that. But you need to do a bit more than that. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things I felt when young people were tearing down or wanting to tear down statues, by the way, no one did that with Churchill. They just daubed paint. And I said, fine, these horrific people who were slave owners and all that, their statues, if the local population doesn't want them, get rid of them. Mm. But for the historical statues of people who created the British Empire, you can't tear all of those down because it's part of the history of this country. Mm. And a minority can't determine what that history should be or is. It's the past. But what you can do is where these statues exist, whether it's Churchill's or whoever else is put alternative plaques. So this is the official view, this is the view of the whatever, the Historical Society of Worcestershire. You know, that there is another view. And in a world where increasingly the mainstream media speaks with one voice on many questions, it's very important for the proper functioning of democracy to have another view.
When you were researching Churchill, and I mean, one of the enduring myths about him as a person is that he was this great, far-seeing military mind. And of course, the way that you describe him, the way that many others describe him is anything but that. Is somebody that maybe when he was young desperately wanted to become this kind of person, but that ultimately failed on multiple occasions and was proven wrong on several of these very key decisions that he had to make. How much of Churchill in your mind is somebody that deserves to stand out as a singular person versus somebody who was merely almost a consequential figure of his time and those last decades of the British Empire?
I think Churchill was desperate to be a military leader. He had that in him. He didn't go to university. He went to Sandhurst, the military academy in Britain. After a number of attempts, he finally got in because the entrance to Sandhurst was very difficult and jealously guarded. But he got in, but he never made it in that sense. You know, he had these fantasies and illusions that he was a great military leader and military strategist. But no one serious within the army, at the top levels of the army, ever believed that. And when he was given the chance to implement his strategic thinking, they were disasters. You know, the Dardanelles in the First World War led to numerous deaths because of bad thinking, strategic incompetence. Churchill insisting it be done in a particular way, others opposing it, and they were proved right. So finally, I think the only role he could play was resisting the German advances in the Second World War, defending the British Empire. And this too, if we're truthful, the people who won the Second World War was the Soviet Union, the Russians of that time, and the United States. The combination of these two big powers basically, in different ways, destroyed the Third Reich. On its own, Britain couldn't have done it because the empire was in decline. But obviously, one shouldn't take away from Churchill his attempts to mobilize the people, which, most other politicians would have attempted. Churchill had more flair in that regard because of how he regarded himself. And so he could play that role. But as a politician, I mean, I don't think he was that consequential. And look, even as far as the Second World War is concerned, had Hitler decided to crush the British expeditionary force in France at the time of Dunkirk, Britain might have fallen. What is interesting, and I speculate in the book, as to why Hitler didn't do it. Many different stories, but the most authoritative one is Hitler said that the British Empire is too big for us to govern. So if we completely destroy the British Army, who will run the British Empire? The Germans can't do it on their own. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure I believe that, because, the French Empire was carried on existing while France was occupied by the Germans. The Germans collaborated with the French colonial officers and etc. So it's a strange business, because if you look now at the records, the Germans were within hours of taking Dunkirk, and that would have been the end of the British Expeditionary Force. But they didn't do it, and the German generals were going mad, because just as they were about to reach Dunkirk, General Guderian was ordered to stop. He said, "Where are these crazy orders coming from, Herr the Führer?" "Why?" he shouted. No one could tell him. And so it remains a bit of a mystery as to how and why that happened. I mean, of course, we're thrilled it didn't happen, but the question is raised. So the mythology that has been created around Churchill, especially and including during the Second World War, needs to be studied in detail, and that is what I've attempted to do. And also to show them what the history of this empire was and what it did, and that history is still with us. The division of the Middle East during the Ottoman period, the Middle East as we know it now, was one large space, a space in which towns dominated, not states, not nations. So you could go to school in Jerusalem, go to secondary school in Amman, and go to the university in Cairo. Normal for people, young Arabs being educated. That creating it into little states, dividing it between France and Britain, I think, as we can see, was not a great idea as far as the Arab people are concerned. It effectively led to the whole idea of an Arab nation, an independent Arab nation, being wrecked by all this. And divide and rule, of course, traditionally is the way imperial powers roll. Look at what the Americans did in Yugoslavia, what they're doing in Syria, what they're doing in Somalia, etc. So it's the consequences are still with us, and not to mention what they did in Palestine and the Nakba. I have to be honest with you. When I wake up these days and look at the newspapers or look at the messages I'm getting on my Twitter and Facebook accounts from Palestine and Palestinians, I really want to weep. And in my head I weep, because of what is effectively taking place is the erasure, the destruction of Palestine. And the West, once again, is collaborating in all that. And the people who get very worked up about Ukraine don't think about Palestine, don't think about Yemen, don't think about Syria, don't think about Libya. So these are dangerous times, and that too is part of the imperial legacy. for which Churchill was responsible. He said there are good Jews and there are bad Jews. The bad Jews make revolutions, and the good Jews are Zionists who want to build their own state in Palestine. So a lot of the troubles in today's world are the outcome of Churchill and imperial policies carried out by the British in that part of the world. So there's no forgiveness.
And I wanted to ask you, because I mean, you yourself were born in what was British India at the time, just years before partition, and no doubt your own life and the lives of people around you were directly impacted by these policies, the consequences of this policy of separation and division, and you document how Churchill was one of the advocates of that in Ireland and in the Middle East and in the subcontinent. Is that in your mind far from what happened in World War II and what happened?
Well, I mean, yes, there were alternatives. Wherever the British Empire went, they found an easier way. The easiest way to rule was to divide. So they found minorities who they could support against the majority, or they did that in Ireland, they did that to a certain extent in India. Curzon divided Bengal in India, partitioned it in 1911. It was like a rehearsal, a dry run for what happened in 1947. So they were thinking about all these things in the last 100 years of the empire and carrying them out. And India was particularly disastrous, not simply because of the way in which partition was hurriedly devised, but also the famine in Bengal, which there's a debate whether 3 million people died or 5 million people died. I mean, whatever, it's horrific. And this was a man-made disaster. The War Cabinet under Churchill and Attlee, the Labour Party was the same on many of these subjects. They decided there was nothing they could do to help Bengal. When they're taking all the rice out of the province, there's mass starvation, people are dying on the streets, there's nothing we can do. The British Viceroy in India, Lord Wavell, was shocked. His wife visited Bengal. She said, I have never seen human beings in this state. Welcome to the British Empire. And she pleaded for help. She did, what she could herself, but it was nothing on the scale. And Wavell's correspondence with London is quite sharp, saying, what do you think you're up to? So it's not a good story. And the attempt to make it into a good story, which started happening mainly in the Thatcher years, not exclusively, and is carried on if you look at the bulk of the books that are written. I mean, the British historians who claim to be important historians and and pride themselves rarely mention Kenya. And the brutality with which the Kenyan people were treated by the white British who were there and occupying them and basically trying to divide Kenyas. So the best lands were given and handed over to the whites, as in Rhodesia before. And an American historian, Caroline Elkins, in Harvard, wrote a couple of books on Kenya. Most British historians, mainstream historians, ignored this completely. I remember in a debate with Niall Ferguson in the United States many years ago, I raised Kenya and no, rubbish. Well, now the American academics are saying it. These British historians are saying, no, it did happen, we didn't cover it, etc. anything but rubbish. So this attempt of to override and to make invisible things which very clearly happened is not working. And I have to say that, many American historians are producing better histories of the British Empire than British ones. Very noticeable.
Throughout your career, there's been this this drive to present an alternative narrative of world history as it has been dictated and written by European voices for a long time. What was the driving force behind that? What inspired you and continues to inspire you to be that alternative voice?
It's not so much to be an alternative voice, though it has become that, but it's to tell the truth and not conceal things. So sometimes there are, exaggerations and untruths written, but the most common way in which many mainstream historians, not all of them write, is to conceal it, don't talk about it. It'll go away, people will forget. I mean, for instance, in the Churchill book, I give an account of the disastrous intervention against the Russian Revolution by Churchill and others. And the stories I have found to tell were there for people to find. They didn't. They turned their back on them. There were mutinies inside the British Army, which was sent to Russia. Senior officer from South Africa, actually, refused the orders from Churchill to use chemical warfare against villages captured by the Bolsheviks. He said, we're not going to do it. They just... World War I had ended, and the use of gas had offended everyone, used by both sides, not just the Germans. So this guy said, no, we're not going to use it. He is an incredibly popular officer. Churchill ordered that he be court-martialed and presumably shot. But he was so popular that the British High Command didn't do that. So instead they fought to end the intervention. They said it's impossible, it's not working. We were told we were coming to Russia to pick up British stragglers from the First World War, but this is a war to destroy a revolution, which we don't like. This is not the way to go about it. And these stories, I was really asked at 2 or 3 different meetings, Tariq, where did you get this information? I said, from the library. I don't have the resources as an individual to go and hire researchers, and I go into libraries and find the books. And that is the way I do it, precisely to debate and challenge what the mainstream historians are doing, and they're doing it for a particular purpose. The whole atmosphere changes. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, there was a big shift in the culture. For instance, on the First World War, there was huge criticism, because many of those who had fought were alive, and they knew it was a horrible war. They knew they would never do that again. They hated it. They wrote vicious songs. There were plays put on the stage attacking that war. But just a few years ago, they were lifting that war. It's a great war once again, putting all the blame on the Germans, etc., etc. So the way the culture shifts depends very much on what is happening outside that particular field as well. Mm-hmm. So satire, challenging government verities, the emergence of satirical magazines like Private Eye, all this helped. And that world is not totally disappeared, but it's become very different. Mm-hmm. And that's why I write, really. I mean, when I was writing my set of novels on the clashes between Islamic civilization and Western Christendom, the what is now called the Islam Quintet, my 5 novels. And people again said, my God, we didn't even know Islam was in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Wow, really?
Yes. And not just, they were intelligent people. They said, we had no idea. And when I went, the book was, my first novel was published in Spain, Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree. Kids would come up to me, they said, Islam was here for 600 years? I said, yeah. And they didn't force you to join. Lots of Spanish people, it was just joined, became Muslims. So that is now, I'm happy to say, on the course list, or it was, now that the right is going to win again. There's probably a school course list, so people know their own history.
Yeah.
And that applies to the history of the past, but also history as it is being made. I mean, if you look at Ukraine, everyone will think it's just Putin. Not Putin did a very bad thing, invading a country and declaring that the national self-determination of Ukraine was over. Okay, I don't support it. But nor do I support the previous 20 years in which NATO had been moving further and further closer to Russia to provoke, warned by its own people. CIA chief, the guy now warned them, don't do it. Don't try and drag Ukraine into NATO. It's a step too far. They didn't listen. So to just blame Putin without seeing the circumstances that led up to it, that's how they do wars. So, the Iraq War, virtually the same. Saddam was the ally. They used Saddam to fight against Iran. So to answer your question, it's when the media became a total instrument of the governments, and this happens especially when the wars are being fought. And the 21st century has become a century of wars. People thought there would be a peace dividend, but no. There's no peace dividend for the Palestinians, for the Arab people whose countries are being invaded, etc. So in these circumstances, when I don't find anything, I just sit down and write a book. I wrote a book on 9/11, Daesh fundamentalisms, on Iraq, Bush in Babylon, on Obama. When he came to power in the United States, he was elected. Lots of liberals and well-meaning people said, our black president. I said, attention, he may be black, but what is he going to do? And we now know what he did. Sent in more troops into Afghanistan, deported more people than Bush from the United States, but just like anyone else. It's like in Britain today. I mean, Rishi Sunak is effectively a second-rate banker. That's what he is. That the Tories have made him Prime Minister indicates their own problems in terms of not having leadership and not being able to deal with the situation under Boris. But the fact that Sunak is non-white, or that this completely imbecilical woman, Suella Braverman, is non-white, what does it mean? It means nothing. They're politicians. They carry on in the same old way. So using identity politics to determine whether something is progressive or not, it doesn't always work. Sometimes it does, but not in the case of mainstream politics. So I write, it's the way I go and speak at demonstrations for Palestine or against wars. But my main activity now, the last few years, has been writing, producing books, and then going and arguing in favor of them.
And I'm glad that you mentioned Shadow of the Pomegranate Tree, which is a book that I love quite a bit. And I remember my experience reading that and reading the ending to that as well, with the scenes that you describe of the book burnings during the Inquisition. And And I found myself getting really emotional about the idea of how much knowledge could be lost and how many books could be lost forever, essentially, because of acts like this. And it reminds me of just the power that exists in who gets to tell history and who gets to narrate the events of our past and our present. Do you feel like today there are a lot more voices like yourselves that are from the global south, especially from that perspective, challenging the way that history is told?
Yeah, I think there are a lot more voices. I mean, there's a whole layer now of young writers writing fiction, mainly in India, Pakistan, Egypt, Algeria, all over the world, which was first they themselves saw completely through European eyes. And that's changed. That has changed a lot. When I did Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree in Spain, I got a letter from an Arab writer saying how nice you've done this book and I like it very much. And I've written a book too on Spain. And Rado Ashwood, her name was. So we became friends. She was married to a Palestinian, a poet, Murid. And so we became friends as a result of writing this and discussed how she had written it and how I'd written it. But I was very thrilled by that because I said people are beginning to wake up a bit, and more people are doing this. I'll tell you a sort of interesting story about Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree. When that book came out in 91 or 92, really, I tell you honestly, very few people knew about Islam's history in Europe. Very few, including in Spain and Portugal. I got a phone call from a very top Hollywood agent. He said, "Hi, Mr. Ali, I've read your novel. I love it. It's totally cinematic. I would like to make it into a movie. And could I just explore with 3 or 4 top directors what they think, get them to read it, and I'll be back in touch." I said, "Yeah, fine, I can't stop you. Do as you wish." Within a fortnight, he'd run back and said, "I've shown it to a number of directors, and they love it. But they say in Hollywood," and he said, "I'm now going to ask you a crass question," and I know you will scream, but I have to ask it. But 2 of these directors said, if he agreed to change 90% of the characters to Jews, we would make the film.
Wow. Really?
Oh, really? So I said to him, I did scream. He said, "I know, you're right. You're going to tell me to jump." I said, "I wouldn't even consider it, because the whole point of recovering the history of Islam in Spain and elsewhere in Europe is to tell stories that people don't know." And I said, it is not the case that it was the Jewish people who ran Spain. On the contrary, there are nice stories about the collaboration of Muslims and Jews, of how Jews got the highest positions they've ever had in Islamic Spain and Islamic Portugal. So he said, "I know. I'm really sorry. Forgive me." I said, "It's okay. Don't worry."
You weren't surprised.
But even I was surprised. Well, how can you're telling a historical story. How can you change it and make it completely false? When I write historical novels, I never change the facts about inventing wars of this. I invent characters, but around historical facts. So I was really shocked by that.
I think today there is, more than any time in recent memory, there's a real challenge to the history and the retelling of history of empire, of the British Empire, of European colonialism, and of the story that I think has been commonplace, certainly for the last 100 years, in the way that Britain saw itself, in the way that European history was taught. What do you think the consequence of this has been in terms of how people in the UK, British people, see themselves, see their own identity and their place in history?
Well, I think a lot has changed in Britain since the Second World War, slowly. But it has changed, and there are large numbers of people who don't, who say the empire was a disgrace. Not a majority, I don't think, because they're quite proud of it. And they're proud of it on a strange level, not that we went and killed so many people, but that how could people from this tiny little island go and conquer the world? That's how they look at it. And I can understand why they do that. But that is not enough for them to justify what Britain did. And the European powers, it wasn't just Britain, all the powers of Europe did this and participated in the rape of Africa. The whole continent was taken by the Europeans, and the British, of course, got the largest share, both in Africa and also in Asia. I mean, they took quite a lot. Now, the interesting thing is that the Americans wouldn't let the Europeans come to Latin America or South America. The Monroe Doctrine was put into place by the United States under President Monroe, who said, this is our backyard. You're not allowed in here. But the interesting thing is, I once saw this figure, which interested and amazed me, is that Britain made more money out of its trade with Argentina than it did make money from large parts of Africa and other colonies. They needed these colonies to assert British hegemony. But in terms of money-making, of course, they made money in South Africa from the gold mines. They made money in India and Pakistan, what is now Pakistan, through other means. But in quite a few countries in Africa, etc., they didn't make that much money. But the ownership of the territory was absolutely essential so that they could actually take money. But the Argentinian model was just a trade model. They went, they traded, they built stuff, and the profits were very high. So they could have done that. There was an alternative way of dealing with it.
Do you think this revision of history that is taking place, very much alive right now, is linked to this revitalization of Winston Churchill's image? This the way people talk about him right now, the fact that there's been dozens of books that have been published just in the last couple of years alone. Do you think there is a link between people trying to reimagine or revive their idea of Britain?
This Churchill worship is very much a state-induced enterprise. They wanted it. They had the historians, they had the broadcasters, filmmakers, because they wanted something for themselves. And Churchill, especially when they started reviving these sub-imperial dreams like Thatcher going and taking the Falklands, islands with whose return to Argentina was being negotiated by the British themselves. The Argentinians were stupid in how they behaved, but in any event, that revived Churchill and the uses of Churchill. And, since the beginning of this century, Britain has been involved in wars, not as an independent power, but as a power totally acting with and on behalf of the United States. And so Churchill offers a possibility of saying, well, look, we produced Churchill. That was long before we were the slaves of the United States. And so we have our own independent thing. They think it provides, Churchill gives them an alibi of continuity between the British Empire and what they're doing now. And of course that isn't the case, because they couldn't do anything without the United States today. But Churchill is used for that function. And it's not that all U.S. presidents have been pro-Churchill. Obama wasn't. He was of Kenyan origin, partially. And he didn't like Churchill. Biden had his statue removed from the Oval Office because he said, I come from Ireland. And, I know what Churchill and the Brits did there. So it's not even that universal within the Western world. And other European countries have their own heroes. I mean, France has de Gaulle. The Germans don't, because, you can't use Hitler as a model because of what he did. But by and large, and also in quite a few parts of Eastern Europe, people are discovering old fascists and fought against the West in the Second World War. Their statues are being re-erected, etc., etc. It's a very strange transitional atmosphere. I don't think it will last long, but it might be another 30 or 40 years before we see changes. And then the world itself has changed. China, major part, playing a very big role in frightening the United States that they might be overtaken. The new Cold War that they've started against China, and they're undecided on that. They say stupid things. They suddenly try and provoke the Chinese. And the Chinese till now, they started replying, thank God. For a long time they didn't reply to the U.S. Now they've started replying and asserting themselves, and that has divided the rulers of the United States. One day they go and apologize. The second day they attack them again. They themselves don't know what they're up to.
There's a sense reading this book that you are not only documenting the era of Churchill, but also essentially the last decades of the British Empire. This empire that is in decline and desperately trying to hold on to what it can in its colonies and at home in Ireland, and looking to the world that exists today and people fighting over the soul of British history, whether it was a great empire or was a terrible one. And with what's happening in the U.S. now and the fears in the U.S. about whether it is in its own decline, how do you see the situation now and going forward? Are we just in a historical loop where people are repeating the same mistakes over and over again? Are we going to see a similar sad and violent end to an American empire?
Look, I am in a minority on this because many people, progressive people, engage in too much wishful thinking. They say that the Americans run their last. This American declinism has been a big subject of debate, both within the academy and amongst think tanks. Well, obviously the United States is not as powerful ideologically as it was immediately after the Second World War in the 40s and 50s to a certain extent. But the fact remains the same, that there is no power capable of challenging capitalism on this globe. The Chinese have become very strong is because they managed successfully to create a state capitalism which they control. They don't give it total freedom to do what it wants, but That's how they grew, and that has made the Americans nervous. But let me just give you one example. China is like Victorian Britain, the workshop of the world. Virtually everything you see is produced in China. But all the top equipment, the necessary equipment, the spare parts which are needed in the present world, technologically, are still dominated by the United States. So even economically, they haven't declined as much as some people would like to think. Militarily, they are the most powerful country in the world. I mean, the Chinese can't compete with them, and I hope they don't, because that will damage their own resources. But the United States military spending is higher than the next 8 countries put together.
Yeah.
So you can't talk about declinism. My fear is that the Americans would rather destroy the world than give up their hegemony, their privileges, etc. People used to say after the Americans were defeated in Vietnam in 1975, this is the end of the American empire. And even though we were very happy they were defeated, we said it's not the end. After Afghanistan, people said they won't intervene anywhere. Well, they're intervening in Europe now and trying to shore up this slightly strange regime, which is composed of Ukrainian nationalists, Ukrainian fascists, and Zelensky, who's used as a propagandist globally. So it's not correct to say that the United States is on the path of inevitable decline like the British were. It's a continent. North America is a continent. Britain was a tiny island. It has its own resources. It has produced, and I say this as a critic of the American empire. I mean, the fact that the biggest and most important discovery technologically over the last decades, the web, the World Wide Web, was produced on the west coast of the United States and not the west coast of China. It speaks for itself.
So we're stuck with them for the time being.
I fear so, and the only way, in my opinion, is to resist. But, I return to Palestine. This upsets me more than even I could imagine. Just people, children being targeted, children being killed. The humiliation of the Palestinians, hardly covered in the mainstream press. It is a sign of how powerful the United States are. This is not Israel, by the way. I mean, they, of course, carry out this stuff, and it's their way of exercising and running the occupation of Palestine. But without if the United States were to say to the Israelis, pull away from all the occupied territories, or we're going to cut off, we're going to sanction you, like they do with any other country, it wouldn't be long before the Israelis began to feel the pressure. What happens in Israel and what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians is supported fully by the United States. So one, shouldn't underestimate their impact at all.
Finally, Tariq, do you have any words of advice to younger writers, younger activists, people that are wanting to really challenge the narratives of empire as they exist today?
Yeah. My advice is do it. Sometimes it might affect your career adversely if you're in the academies, because they're tightening up now what academics can write and what they can't write and what they can speak and can't speak. I mean, university professors are being sacked from British universities for talking about Palestine. There's a famous case in Bristol going on even as we speak. What is this? And this has to be resisted. And resist it in openly resist it with a clear language. Don't try and cover it up by conceptualizing it to such a degree that what you're trying to say can't be understood by anyone. That can happen and has happened. So my advice is resist, intellectual resistance, cultural resistance. Hey, when you try and resist peacefully, like through the BDS movement, they've passed laws now to stop that happening. So a peaceful opposition to Israeli hegemony is not permitted. What do they want to push people to become individual terrorists? I mean, you feel sometimes that's how they're behaving and acting. But so my advice is use your brains, use your pens, use your computers to fight this sort of appalling sickness that we witness every day.
Tariq Ali, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to our guest today, Tariq Ali. We want to hear what you have to say about Winston Churchill, about Britain and its history, and about the current climate that we are seeing happening in Gaza. So please leave your thoughts in the comments below and let us know who you'd like us to speak to next. As always, you can find all of our episodes in audio format wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, salam.